know John Rutten?
John Rutten?
Rutten.
Oh yeah, I went to school with him.
Ship or anything that developed between you guys?
Yeah, I mean we dated. You know, I mean, what's this all about?
Have you ever met his wife?
I may have.
Do you remember her name or anything, or? Or what she did for a living, or where she worked, or anything about her?
Well, I think I'm going to say that I think she was a nurse. Shelly, Sherri, I don't know, something. I mean...
Circumstances worse regarding her death?
Jeez, let me think back. Jeez. I don't understand why you're talking about some guy I dated 1,000,000 years ago.
Well, do you know what happened to his wife?
Yeah, I know she got killed.
Friend said that you and her were having a problem because of the John situation.
Well, are you guys, is this something, I mean, you said I was going to interview somebody about art.
On a Friday morning in 2009, Detective Stephanie Lazarus walked into LAPD headquarters thinking she was helping a colleague solve a routine art theft. She wore a gold badge. She carried a Glock on her hip. She had spent 25 years climbing the ranks of the nation's most famous police department. She had no idea that 60 seconds later, her own partners would disarm her, read her Miranda rights, and lock her in handcuffs for a cold-blooded execution. 23 years earlier, in a quiet Van Nuys condo, 29-year-old newlywed nurse Sherri Rasmussen was beaten within an inch of her life, bitten on the arm, and shot 3 times in the chest through a quilted blanket with a .38 caliber revolver. For 2 decades, the LAPD told the victim's grieving father that his daughter was killed by random burglars. They told him to stop blaming the jealous ex-girlfriend who was stalking her. They told him that because that ex-girlfriend was one of their own. It took 23 years, an ignored father's warning, a bite mark preserved in a coroner's freezer, and a discarded soda cup pulled from a Costco trash can, to prove a match so precise that the odds of it belonging to anyone else on Earth were 1 in 402 quadrillion. The decorated detective solving robberies on the 3rd floor was the person who pulled the trigger. This is the story of how an LAPD cop almost got away with the perfect murder. You're watching Mysterious Crime Chronicles, where the cases the world forgot get remembered. If this is your first time here, this is exactly what we do. We take you inside the investigations nobody thought would ever close, and we tell you the truth, start to finish, no matter how long it took to find it.
Well, are you guys, is this something, if the conversation lasted a few minutes, I can't even remember, and what is it like, we went out to lunch or anything? Really shocked that somebody would be saying that I did this. I mean, we had a fight, and so I went and killed her. I mean, come on.
Stephanie, you know you have the right to remain silent. Do you understand?
Yes.
Anything you say may be used against you in court. Do you understand?
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Stephanie Eileen Lazarus, guilty of the crime of murder of Sherri Rasmussen in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony, as charged in Count 1 of the information.
Before we get into it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's go back to where this really begins. Not in 2009. Not even in 1986. This begins in a UCLA dorm hallway, in the late 1970s, with 2 teenagers who had no idea that one of them would spend the next 4 decades destroying the other's family. Stephanie Lazarus grew up in Simi Valley, California, the kind of clean, quiet suburb where nothing was supposed to go wrong. Her family was respectable, middle class, unremarkable. At UCLA she was popular. She ran with the athletes, the fraternity crowd, the kind of social circle that photographs well. She was, by every account people gave later, likable. Funny. The friend everyone wanted at the party. That's where she met John Rutten. Their relationship, if you could even call it that, was loose. On again, off again. Casual in the way college relationships often are, except Lazarus never treated it as casual. Not really. Not underneath. Friends would later describe her as someone who never fully let go of Ruetten, even as the years passed, even as they both grew into separate adult lives. Lazarus joined the Los Angeles Police Department. She became a patrol officer, young and ambitious, the kind of recruit supervisors point to as a success story. Meanwhile, Ruetten met a woman named Sherri Rasmussen. Sherri was the opposite of chaos. She was a hospital nursing director, driven, warm, well-liked by her staff, the kind of woman co-workers describe using words like steady and kind. She and Ruetten fell in love, got engaged, and set a wedding date. And somewhere in that timeline, the exact details would only come out decades later, under oath, in a courtroom. Ruetten admitted something devastating. He and Lazarus slept together one more time. After the engagement. Sherri didn't know that. But she knew something was wrong. She confronted Lazarus directly. More than once. Co-workers and friends later testified that Sherri told them she was frightened of this woman, this off-and-on ex-girlfriend of her fiancé's who kept appearing at the edges of her life. Sherri told people Lazarus had come to her workplace. Sherri told people she felt like she was being watched. Nobody wrote any of it down in a police file. Not yet. There was no reason to. Nothing had happened yet. John and Sherri married in late 1985. 3 months later, Sherri Rasmussen would be dead on her living room floor. February 24, 1986. A Monday. John Ruetten left for work that morning around 7:20. Sherri was still deciding whether she felt well enough to go into the hospital. She'd been fighting a cold. It was an ordinary decision, the kind of small choice nobody remembers making until it becomes the last one. By midday, a neighbor noticed something odd, the garage door standing wide open, no car inside. Small things, easy to explain away. Except John called the house around lunchtime and got no answer. He called her office. Her secretary hadn't seen her either. He called again. And again. Nothing. Not even the answering machine picked up. The one that was supposed to catch calls when nobody was home had never been turned on that day. By the time John got back to the condo that afternoon, the small, explainable things had piled into something he couldn't explain away anymore. Broken glass scattered along the driveway. The garage still open. Sherri's silver BMW gone. He went inside. He found her on the living room floor. She had been beaten with enough force to fracture bone. She had a deep, distinct bite mark on her forearm, the kind of wound that happens in a struggle so close and so violent that the person on top of her had their mouth against her skin. She had ligature marks on her wrists, as if she'd been restrained with a cord at some point during the attack. And she had been shot 3 times in the chest, through a blanket that had been pressed against her, muffling the sound, or perhaps just close enough that the shooter didn't need to think about muffling anything at all. The sliding glass door at the back of the condo was shattered. Glass on the outside of the frame, not the inside, the kind of detail that would matter enormously, decades later, and that almost nobody paid attention to that day. Because on February 24, 1986, the story the LAPD told itself was simple. A break-in. 2, maybe 3 intruders. A young wife home alone, caught in the middle of a robbery that went wrong. Her car was missing, of course it was a burglary. What else would it be? The BMW was found abandoned a few streets away within days. Nothing had actually been taken from inside the condo. No jewelry gone. No electronics gone. Nothing except a life. Nobody at the LAPD stopped to ask themselves the obvious question: what kind of burglar shatters a glass door from the outside, steals a car, and takes nothing else? Sherri's father, Nuys Rasmussen, asked that question immediately. Within days of his daughter's murder, before the funeral had even happened, he gave investigators a name: Stephanie Lazarus. He told them about the confrontations at Sherri's workplace. He told them about the ex-girlfriend who couldn't seem to accept that John had moved on. He told them, as plainly as a grieving father could tell anyone anything, that he believed this woman had killed his daughter. That conversation was never properly documented. Somewhere between a father's desperate warning and a case file, it disappeared. Officially, on paper, it was as if it had never happened. 13 days after Sherri Rasmussen was murdered, Stephanie Lazarus reported her own gun stolen again. 13 days after a young nurse was shot 3 times with a .38 caliber revolver, the woman her victim's father had already named as a suspect walked into a police station as a fellow officer, trusted without question, and filed a report that her handgun had disappeared. Nobody connected it. Nobody cross-referenced it. It sat in a filing system, one report among thousands, completely disconnected from a murder happening across the city because nobody was looking for a connection. Nobody was looking at Lazarus at all. The investigation into Sherri's murder slowed within weeks. Detectives had a burglary theory and no leads to back it up. Physical evidence was collected, the bite mark was swabbed, standard procedure even then, but DNA testing in 1986 wasn't remotely capable of what it can do today. The swab was packaged, labeled, and placed into evidence storage. And then the case went cold. Not cold like a puzzle nobody could solve. Cold like a door somebody quietly closed. Here's the part of this story that should make you angry, because it's supposed to. While Sherri Rasmussen's murder sat untouched in a records room, Stephanie Lazarus's career didn't stall. It flourished. She moved from patrol into more specialized units. She earned commendations. She built a reputation as sharp, capable, the kind of officer other officers respected. Eventually she landed a coveted assignment, the LAPD's art theft detail, investigating stolen paintings and antiquities for one of the highest-profile police departments in the country. She gave interviews to reporters about her cases. She spoke at conferences. She was, by every outward measure, a success story. In 1996, a full decade after Sherri's murder, Lazarus married a fellow LAPD detective named Scott Young. They settled in Simi Valley, the same kind of quiet suburb she'd grown up in. They adopted a daughter together. From the outside, it was a normal life. A police family. Barbecues, a mortgage, a career. Nobody who worked beside her, patrolled with her, investigated cases with her, trusted her with their own safety, had any idea that this woman had once stood in a stranger's living room and ended a life with a gun that she'd later reported stolen. For 23 years, Stephanie Lazarus lived 2 lives that never touched. In one, she was the officer other officers wanted on their team. In the other, she was the reason a father had spent 2 decades watching his other children grow up while his oldest daughter's killer walked free, wearing a badge, carrying a weapon issued by the very department that was supposed to have caught her. In 2001, the LAPD formed a cold case homicide unit, a small group of detectives whose entire job was to go back through decades of unsolved murders and see what modern science could do with evidence nobody had been able to use before. Sherri Rasmussen's file eventually landed on their desks. It took years. In December of 2004, a criminalist named Jennifer Francis went looking for the original bite mark evidence from the 1986 crime scene. She found it exactly where it had been left, a swab, sealed in an envelope, sitting in a freezer at the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's office. It had been there for 18 years. DNA testing had transformed almost beyond recognition since 1986. Francis ran the sample. The result upended the entire case in a single moment. The genetic profile recovered from that bite mark didn't belong to a man. It belonged to a woman. 20 years of investigation had been built on a theory of 2 male burglars. That theory was now, provably, wrong. There had never been a burglary. There had never been intruders at all. Sherri Rasmussen had opened her door, or more likely, never needed to, because she already knew the person who came inside, to a woman. And even after that discovery, the case still didn't move quickly. There's a detail here that almost nobody talks about, and it deserves to be said plainly. The DNA sample had reportedly been signed out of evidence storage as early as 1993, more than a decade before Francis actually tested it in 2005. What happened to it in those years, why it took so long to run a test that could have identified a killer far sooner, has never been fully explained. Somewhere in that gap, more time passed. More time Nels Rasmussen spent waiting for an answer that had, technically, already been sitting in a freezer the entire time. By early 2009, Detective Jim Nuttall had taken over the reopened investigation. He did something remarkably simple that nobody else had done in 23 years. He sat down with John Ruetten and actually listened. Ruetten told him about Stephanie Lazarus. Told him they'd dated, on and off, through college and after. Told him she'd struggled to accept his relationship with Sherri. And then Ruetten said something that should stop you cold. He told Nuttall he had already given the LAPD her name, back in 1986, in the days right after the murder. The same information Nels Rasmussen had handed investigators. Given twice, by 2 different people who both knew Lazarus, in the immediate aftermath of the murder. And for 23 years, none of it had ever been written into an official file. Nuttall looked at Lazarus's employee record. LAPD officer. 25 years on the job by that point. A detective, working art theft, respected, trusted, armed. He needed her DNA, quietly, without tipping her off, because tipping off a trained homicide detective that she was under investigation for murder was not something you did carelessly. The department assembled a covert surveillance team and began following one of their own colleagues. They tracked her to a Costco in Simi Valley. She bought a drink. She finished it. She threw the empty cup and straw into a public trash can outside the store, the way anyone does 100 times a year without a second thought. Investigators retrieved it before the trash was ever collected. The lab ran a comparison against the bite mark profile from 1986. It was a partial match, enough to move forward, not yet enough to arrest. They needed a confirmed sample, taken directly, under circumstances that would hold up in court. So on June 5, 2009, 2 detectives called Stephanie Lazarus and asked for her help. They told her they had a suspect downstairs at headquarters who needed to be interviewed about an art theft case, and they wanted her expertise in the room. She said yes without hesitation. Of course she did. This was her job. This was the version of herself she'd spent 23 years building. She surrendered her firearm at the door, standard procedure before entering the interview area. She'd done it herself 100 times with suspects of her own. She walked downstairs believing she was about to help solve a case. There was no suspect waiting for her. There was an interrogation room. And there were 2 homicide detectives, sitting across from a colleague they had spent months quietly building a case against. They told her the truth. They wanted to talk about Sherri Rasmussen. For a moment, Lazarus tried the same detachment she must have used on suspects herself. Sherri? Sherri? I think she worked at a hospital somewhere. I might have talked to her once or twice. A woman she had shot 3 times, reduced to a stranger she barely remembered. The detectives pressed. They didn't accuse her outright, they let her fill the silence herself, the way she surely knew, better than almost anyone in that building, that guilty people eventually do. And then she said it. The sentence that ended 23 years of freedom in a single breath. I am really shocked that somebody would be saying that I did this. That we had a fight, and so I went and killed her? I mean, come on. Nobody in that room had used the word fight. Nobody had described any physical confrontation at all. She had just told two detectives, unprompted, the shape of a night she'd sworn for over 2 decades she knew nothing about. She was asked, before she left that room, to provide an oral swab. In custody, under her own badge number, she gave it. It was a perfect match. Within minutes, detectives who had spent their careers working alongside her disarmed her, read her the same Miranda rights she had read to countless suspects herself, and placed her under arrest for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. The trial began in downtown Los Angeles in February of 2012, 26 years after Sherri Rasmussen died. Prosecutors built their case around a phrase one deputy district attorney used to open the trial: or a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart. Jennifer Francis, the criminalist, testified that the genetic markers connecting the oral swab to the bite mark would be expected to appear in roughly 1 in 402 quadrillion people. An independent lab later ran its own confirmation across 15 genetic markers, and prosecutors told the jury the odds that the DNA belonged to anyone other than Stephanie Lazarus were 1 in 1.7 sextillion, the number 17 digits long, followed by 20 zeros. The defense fought hard. Lazarus's attorney argued the evidence had been mishandled, torn envelopes, questionable chain of custody, decades of storage that could have compromised the sample. He pointed to other burglaries in the area committed with a similar type of weapon. He argued a forensic dentist couldn't definitively match Lazarus's bite pattern to the wound on Sherri's arm. None of it moved the jury. On March 8, 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. Her mother and her husband, Scott Young, left the courtroom the moment the verdict was read. Lazarus herself, by every account of that day, never once turned to look at the jury, and never once looked at the crime scene photos projected on the screen throughout her own trial. In May of 2012, she was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. You would think that's where this story ends. A trial. A conviction. A sentence. Justice, delivered decades late but delivered all the same. It isn't where it ends. Because Stephanie Lazarus never stopped fighting to go home. She maintained her innocence through the trial, through her sentencing, through years of appeals. And then, in 2023, something changed, not her circumstances, but California law. A new statute gave special parole consideration to people who had committed their crimes before the age of 26. Lazarus was 25 when she murdered Sherri Rasmussen. Suddenly, for the first time in over a decade, freedom was a realistic possibility. And that's when, after more than 3 decades of silence, Stephanie Lazarus finally told a version of what happened inside that condo. She said she'd gone to Sherri's home that morning carrying a gun and a cord, wanting to talk to John. She described what followed as a violent, chaotic struggle. She used the words "tenacious bar fight." She said Sherri confronted her, the confrontation turned physical, and somewhere in that struggle, she shot her. On November 13, 2023, a parole board found her suitable for release. Sherri Rasmussen's family was devastated. John Ruetten, the man this entire tragedy had orbited for 37 years, told the board he didn't believe a word of her account. He said Lazarus had used her own police training to cover up the murder for over 2 decades and was now using the same skill to manipulate a parole board. I don't think she comprehends the breadth and depth of the suffering she has caused, he said, in tears. Sherri's sister, Teresa Marie Lane, put it even more bluntly to reporters afterward. The only reason she confessed is because she wants to get out on parole, she said. We really have to keep her in because she has no regard for what she did. She does not have remorse. Their outrage reached all the way to the governor's office. Concerns raised by Governor Gavin Newsom triggered a review, and a rescission hearing was ordered. In the fall of 2024, a parole panel found what officials called good cause to reverse the earlier decision. The grant of parole was revoked. Lazarus would not be going home. A second full hearing took place on February 12, 2025. Lazarus told the board, "I will never, ever harm an individual like I did on February 24, 1986, when I murdered, callously murdered, and heinously murdered Sherri Rasmussen." She apologized for not pleading guilty at trial, all those years earlier, and putting the family through a drawn-out fight. It wasn't enough. Commissioner Kevin Chappell told her directly that her account of a mutual fight didn't match the physical evidence used to convict her, that if this had truly been a struggle between two people, far more of her DNA would likely have been found at the scene. Instead, he said, the evidence showed one person engaging in an extreme, one-sided act of violence. Parole was denied a second time. As of the most recent information available, Stephanie Lazarus remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women, still serving her 27 years to life sentence, waiting for whatever hearing comes next. There's a version of this case where the story is simple. A jealous woman, a rejected love, a murder, a trial, a conviction. Neat. Closed. But that's not actually what happened here, and it's not what should stay with you after this video ends. What should stay with you is a father who named his daughter's killer within days of her death, and was ignored for 23 years. A husband who gave the same name to a different detective decades later, in a conversation that, once again, almost didn't make it into a file. A DNA sample that sat in a freezer for 18 years, and then sat again, unexplained, for another decade after someone finally found it. A police department that spent over 2 decades investigating a burglary that never happened, while the person responsible sat 2 floors above the cold case unit, solving other people's crimes. Sherri Rasmussen didn't get to grow old. She didn't get to build the life she'd just started with John Ruetten. She got 3 months of marriage and a death that her own department spent 23 years refusing to properly investigate, because the truth was standing in their own hallways, wearing the same uniform they did. So here's the question we'll leave you with. Stephanie Lazarus has now spent over a decade telling parole boards she's changed. Her victim's family says every word of it is a performance. You've heard the evidence. You've heard the testimony. You decide, does a person who used 23 years of law enforcement training to hide a murder deserve to walk free, simply because enough time has passed? Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every single one. If this case moved you the way it moved us to make it, do us a favor, hit like, and share this with someone who needs to hear how close this woman came to getting away with it completely. This has been Mysterious Crime Chronicles, where the cases the world forgot get remembered. We'll see you in the next one.